little bit later than I was planning, but today I would like to do a comparison of two more 18th century tactical games and give them the same analysis that I gave late last year for 6 other games that took place in this period across 3 specific vectors of the historical nature of the warfare. And of course, the 2 games I am talking about, or the 2 systems I am talking about, is Bayonet and Musket, which you saw I had a lot to say about Banish All Their Fears as after I played the Battle of Blenheim. I felt that it was a time and worth the effort to look at the way that it is portraying 18th century linear warfare in comparison to other games and sort of the key points that I find are interesting about linear warfare. Next to that is another system that I've been learning and playing a lot over the last few months, and that is Battles from the Age of Reason from Clash of Arms. I'm going to use Lobosits as the example here, just to show you the components. I actually haven't played Lobosits yet, but most of the BAR games are pretty pretty similar in terms of what they're bringing to the table. This, of course, 7 Years' War, this War of Spanish Succession. So there's a 50-year difference between these games, and actually the systems do give themselves a very limited range of years to represent the combat. So while this is a direct comparison, I do think we need to keep in mind that they are games, there are going to be abstractions, and historically the tactics and doctrine in the 50 years between these 2 games would have changed some things somewhat. So I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other at sort of portraying the history, but what I am going to say is which of the games where I think they do a really good job of expressing the history. So let's look and talk about this. You know the Blenheim map. You've seen it before from my playthroughs. This is the Lobosits expansion map. I'm just using this as an example for you with some of the units and whatnot. So the first thing to talk about here before we get into the 3 criteria is the scale of these games. And so here we have Battles from the Age of Reason. We have every strength point on a unit is about 100 men. And so these are Austrians here. They're a little bit more dense formations than probably the Prussians in this game, some of the Prussian formations. So we're talking about a battalion-sized unit here. There's 4 battalions across the line. We've got a command leader, and we've got a wing leader here. There would also be probably an army commander somewhere. But 700 men per battalion. In Bayonets and Musket, we have got the exact same tactical unit, and that is a battalion. The scale of this one, 500 to 600 men in the battalion. Now, those are basically identical. The reason that there might be more here is because later in the 7 Years' War and possibly the War of Austrian Succession, maybe the formations were a little bit denser. But essentially, all things considered, we are talking about the exact same tactical unit. Now, these units are broken up into commands. They're not specifically labeled as brigades in this game, but in Banish All Their Fears, they are organized into a brigade. So this is Enonville's brigade. This brigade has 5 battalions, and that is represented by this counter here on the command display, which we will talk about. I should mention this system, it goes from, I think, 1689 to 1720, so it can capture basically any battle in that period. Battles from the Age of Reason specifically limits itself to 1740 to 1783, so that's War of Austrian Succession all the way through the American Revolution. Beyond that, the designers feel that the mechanics and systems they've developed here would not reflect the warfare, so again, we have to take this comparison with a little bit of a grain of salt. Now, the hex scale in these games are actually different. Bayonet and Musket is actually 200-yard hexes, I believe, and Battles from the Age of Reason are 100-yard hexes. So we've got the same unit scale, but we have twice as much distance on the the Bayonet and Musket Banish All Their Fears map. So, it's interesting that it is done that way. Obviously, with the terrain in BAR, you can get a lot more specific terrain and specific hexes. So you can see here there's like a garden across these 200 yards. This garden in this system would be 1 hex. And you can actually see, not an exact comparison, but this village here is about twice as large as this village here. Assuming that these villages are roughly the same size, there's no guarantee that that is the case. But you do get a lot more detail on the terrain in Battles from the Age of Reason. Is there anything else I need to talk about? No, let's go into the first vector of kind of how these 2 systems compare, and that is going to be fire combat. So we are in the linear warfare age where the flintlock musket was king on the battlefield, and massed volleys were the order of the day. The way that Bayonet and Musket handles fire combat is you've got this fire combat value here on the unit. That represents the firepower, and these are infantry, by the way. The scale on cavalry might be slightly different, I should mention also. The infantry scale is what I told you. So we've got here a 4 fire combat value and a 3 fire combat value. In this game, in Bayonet and Musket, your initial volley actually flips your unit over to having 1 hit, essentially representing that once the initial volley is spent, the musket fire coming out of that unit is going to be reduced because of reloads and cohesion and what have you. But there is a big deal in terms of having that initial volley. What you want to do in this system is use your initial volley on units that have already used theirs, because obviously when you take a hit and then take another hit from that volley, which is always an automatic hit, you're going to take another loss, right? So you're trying to get your massed formations in advantageous positions. BAR is a little bit, or maybe a lot bit more complicated, if we're going to be honest, and it doesn't worry itself with the initial volley. Now, we are, again, 50 years later, so this may represent some additional training on the part of the troops and the ability of commanders to get their units firing more frequently or in a more organized fashion. But the way that BAR handles fire combat is it takes the type of unit, which is another difference. Here we've got infantry, cavalry, dragoons, artillery. Those are the only 4 types of unit in Bayonet and Musket. In BAR, we've got infantry and cavalry and artillery, but the types of troops in those units can be different. So if you have guard or grenadier battalion firing versus musketeers or fusiliers, you're going to have differences, and it's also different by army. That can be reflected in Bayonet and Musket, but it's usually just the firepower value. Here, we're talking about fire multipliers. So based on the range, and foot units can really only fire 1 or 2 hexes, you're going to multiply the fire strength of the units, which is typically capped at 4. So even though you've got a formation, a battalion that's 7 strength points, not all 7 of those can fire out of the front of their hexes. They're usually capped at 4 based on their depth and their line extension. And we'll talk about that in a second. But you're going to multiply the 4 coming out of the hex by the fire value at the range you're talking about. And this gives a really good way for BAR to represent the different fire doctrines of the different armies of this period. So as you see, the Prussian guards and grenadiers and even musketeers are quite good versus fusiliers are about equivalent. The grenadiers of the Austrians are slightly worse than the grenadiers of the Prussians. So you get a lot of really nice gradation of firepower. Now, the way fire is done in Battles from the Edge of Reason is similar to a lot of tactical games that you might be familiar with. When you engage in fire combat, you make your fire against the enemy and do its effects. There's no reciprocal fire. Whereas in Bayonets and Musket, when you flip your unit to do your initial volley, the defending unit also flips over. So there is essentially the ability to, there's no ability to just kind of attack without consequence. And that's because the combat table in Bayonet and Musket is based off of infantry versus infantry combat. They basically put all combat into a single bucket, and it's a die differential. So it's really quick to resolve, and you get different effects. And that initial volley is kind of like a free hit that you're going to get against the enemy units. And then you're going to do this whole thing with modifiers. In BAR, it's a lot more complicated. You've got opportunity fire. So if units move within, I think, 2 hexes of your units, you can opportunity fire them. That kind of represents the exchange of musketry, the danger of marching close to the enemy. You've got to take their fire before you can fire. That is actually quite historical. It's abstracted out here, but here it represents kind of the doctrine of the time. The commanders wanted their, and the French army of the sort of the turn of the 18th century talks about this a lot. Commanders are like, the best skill that a soldier can have is to not fire first. If the enemy is firing first, that means they've lost their nerve, and that you have the advantage. So there's this idea that as you get closer and you take the opportunity fire against you, then you get into position and fire, and you're in a much better spot because you've withstood the enemy's fire. There is no degradation of firepower other than if the unit has taken hits. So unlike here where your initial volley makes you less capable of fire forever forward, it is possible that your fire can be sustained longer because your losses in this game are strength point losses. And again, like I said, usually it's only 4 strength points I can fire out the front of a hex. So you can take some hits before you start to degrade your firepower. There's defensive fire as well when we talk about melee combat and stuff like that. So if you're, if this unit is attacking this hex here, he's got to suffer defensive fire, usually at some sort of increased multiplier. Before he can make his melee attack. That's another area where BAR is more detailed than Bayonet and Musket. In BAR, there is distinct fire and melee phases, and there is actually distinct fire and melee tables. So we've got a fire combat card. It's based on a D100 system. based on the odds ratio of your firepower and multiplier versus the opponent's firepower and multiplier, and then you will fire on these charts. So even forces typically don't do a lot of effect against each other, whereas if you have a big advantage, you're typically going to have something happen to the other formation. Again, like I talked about, the line strength point, so based on how the depth of your formation, whether you've extended your line, which this game allows you to do, then you're going to have sort of like different effectiveness of your fire from a single unit. Formation is another big part of BAR, and we will get to that when we talk about linear warfare and maneuver. There's also a close combat chart. This is primarily going to be used with cavalry, but infantry can close combat as well. That is sort of all wrapped up into combat, like I said, in Bayonet and Musket. Here they are distinct phases. There are morale checks and charge bonuses and penalties that you get when you do this. The one thing about this, and this may be something that's unique to A War of Austrian Succession and 7 Years' War, but a lot of the books that I've been reading about bayonet charges have typically only happened when there is like a terrain. BAR does let you charge and do melee combat in clear terrain. That is something that a lot of historians and a lot of the research that I've done on this area, because I have a personal interest in it, say doesn't happen quite a bit. Usually, soldiers would be reluctant to charge across clear to engage in melee combat, and it's only when you get into like fortified positions, defensive terrain, creeks, stuff like that, that, you know, the soldiers would be forced to move close. So in that way, BAR is reflecting something that is, you know, something the designers may have an opinion about why they allow close combat in clear, but it definitely hews more towards traditional tactical war game structure, that you're allowed to do that, even if in the history there isn't as many examples of that as there would be in, say, the Ancients era or in area further forward than this, like in the Napoleonic era. The combat resolution procedure in BAR, while we're talking about it, there are a lot of steps to go through. You find the odds ratio, you calculate the combat value of each. There's information on the rear of these counters. They've got your morale and your combat value here. It's the +3, it's a modifier. And so you're going to do all of this in row. You make morale checks. It's possible units that go into close combat are going to fail to go into close combat. That is, I guess, more in line with how I understand it. And then you'll roll on this table and you'll get results for both sides. And as you can see, there's the morale checks in here: defensive fire, close combat, advance after combat, and cavalry pursuit is a big one here. It just allows cavalry to chase down infantry who have routed from close combat and so forth. So there's a lot more to the process in fire combat here. They're both essentially going around doing the same thing. It's just that, and you'll read this in the design notes, Banish All Their Fears, Bayonet and Musket has condensed all of that down into a single roll where you do have to go through a multi-step process. It is more narratively heavy when you are doing it in BAR, because you might have specific battalions fail their morale checks when they're charging, or certain battalions will be more effective in fire. So you get kind of an individual story for each unit, whereas the units here feel a lot more homogenous. And again, that may be a reflection of how the armies in the early 18th century versus the mid-18th century were more homogenous in terms of their training, their doctrine, and so forth. So that's fire combat. I think they both do a great job. One is just more procedurally heavy than the other, and they both accomplish what they're trying to do in a way that is thematically understandable and represents kind of the effects that fire combat would have on the armies of the time. The one thing I will say is that casualties in BAR tend to be a lot more. There's a lot more attrition in BAR because you are taking strength point losses. So this 7-4 unit may take 3 casualties and be a 4-4 unit, and he's still fighting at quote unquote full strength because he can still throw out 4 combat strength of fire combat, although in melee he'd be less powerful. And I do really think that the fire multiplier system is a really smart invention for this, and also for La Bataille. In the Bayonet and Musket, the casualties are pretty binary. You've taken a hit when you do your initial volley, you can never get that back, and then you've got usually 2 or 3 more hits before you are just eliminated. Now, in BAR, units route on their own. So there's actually 4 vectors of unit status. There's good order, disorder, shaken, and shaken disorder, and then you can also route. And so this, if you flip it on the back, the R stands for route. So units will route individually. You can have a formation that stays in a battle where all but one of its battalions has routed, and it will continue fighting until it gets routed. In Banish All Their Fears, when a single battalion routes, that may trigger a full route for the rest of the battalions, and that's based on the command chit here. Their morale is a 7, and for each unit that has routed, you subtract 1 from that number, and you roll every time a battalion routes. So you can actually get cascading routes in Bayonet and Musket, whereas in Battles from the Age of Reason, you get a much more attritional battle where formations can stay in the fight a lot longer, and the units don't necessarily disappear. I think it's one of the things I really like about Bayonet and Musket is representing sort of like the brigade morale, where, a cascading rout can happen based on the quality of the brigade. I think it provides a lot of interesting narrative stuff to the game. It also makes attacking into where you choose to attack quite risky, because if you end up taking a hit in a combat and at an attack and rout, suddenly the whole brigade can rout off the map. Again, personal preference, I think that is one of Banish All Their Fears, Bayonet and Musket's unique selling points, is the morale system in this game, whereas this is much more closer to like traditional tactical war games. So that's really all I have to say about the fire combat. They both do a great job. They're both really sort of reflecting kind of the history. They're doing it in different ways. They're both quite good. So let's go on to the second of these categories that we evaluate 18th century games in, and that is the role of cavalry and its interaction on the battlefield with infantry. So I don't have any cavalry units set up here, but I do want to talk about the way that cavalry works. When we did this video the first time, we talked about different games and how they allow cavalry and infantry to interact. In Bayonets and Musket, you can do cavalry versus cavalry combat, and again, in BAR, you can do the same as well, and that would use the close combat here with cavalry. There are cavalry charge in BAR. When you do a cavalry charge, you do have to roll a morale check. Sometimes cavalry will lose the nerve before they move forward and attack, and I think that's quite cool. A lot of times you set up a cavalry charge and it doesn't go off for a while. Both of these games have 20-minute turns, so they're both covering the same time scale of activity. I think the cavalry system in BAR is quite interesting. It's actually cavalry is where you can actually learn the game really well if you have a cavalry-heavy scenario, because you don't have to worry about fire combat. Cavalry are pretty mobile. And, typically the cavalry quality is going to be judged by their morale factor more than anything else in the game. In Banish All Their Fears, cavalry are pretty similar to infantry in terms of like the way that they function. However, you've got different combat results table in Bayonets and Musket, cavalry versus cavalry. This right here is very similar to BAR's melee table. So there's not a lot of difference there. What is cool is that based on the era of the battle you're playing, you get bonuses for charging based on the number of hexes, and this reflects different nations' cavalry doctrine throughout. So whereas BAR has a much more gradated infantry firing by army, like we showed you with the multipliers, Bayonets and Musket does it by nation and year for cavalry. So there's a little bit more of an in-depth look at the cavalry training of the things. Now, cavalry and infantry, this is where it gets really interesting. In BAR, there is no restriction for cavalry fighting infantry. The only thing that you have to worry about is that if you charge infantry as cavalry, defensive fire, you add 10 to the die roll, so it can be pretty murderous. Additionally, cavalry are counted double for their size when they're fired at by infantry. So infantry fire against cavalry in BAR is extremely deadly. If you get your cavalry units surrounded by infantry or within range of infantry, they're probably going to go down or take a lot of casualties. So you typically want to keep your cavalry fighting against cavalry. Now, you do have the option of charging infantry if you would like, and frequently you want to charge infantry in the flanks where they can't do that, or in the rear. And a lot of times cavalry will come in and sweep up infantry that are routing or that are out of position. And like I said, there's cavalry pursuit in Battles from the Age of Reason. So if you do a charge and you do succeed, the pursuit is built into that. And the pursuit, all it does is if you successfully pursue, then you reduce the strength points of the retreating unit for every hex that you pursue. It's a really nice system. I really like it. It gives a little bit of a Napoleonic flavor, and that makes sense because we're getting closer to the Napoleonic era here with the 7 Years' War and the War of Austrian Succession. But there are no rules restrictions about cavalry attacking infantry. So it's pretty free form, and you get to make the decision about how you want to do it. If you want to do something stupid like charge right into the front of an infantry line, you can, but you will probably pay for it, though there is a chance that you might succeed and break through. That, I think, is a perfectly valid and reasonable model for cavalry versus infantry. Here in Bayonets and Musket, cavalry and infantry have very specific rules about how they can engage. Cavalry can attack infantry, but only if the infantry is missing its first volley or the cavalry is attacking the infantry through its flanks. So in this War of Spanish Succession period, early 18th century, the designers have said, cavalry front on infantry, you can't do it. So if you get into a standoff, the cavalry have to stand there, and they're actually vulnerable because the infantry can expend their volley and disorder that cavalry. If the cavalry is already disordered, it actually destroys the cavalry squadron. So you kind of have to be careful if you have sort of worn down cavalry in front of infantry. You're not allowed to attack unless those conditions are met, and also you can be routed quite easily. It gets interesting when we talk about infantry versus cavalry. Infantry can attack cavalry. They must expend their volley if they do it, and that forces the cavalry away into disordered status. But if infantry already have expended their volley, then they basically just force the cavalry to displace one hex, and they do not get to advance. So you can wind up with cavalry-infantry standoffs where no side can get an advantage. And that also kind of conforms to a lot of the reading that I've done, where cavalry kind of just slows infantry down, or infantry are not able to come to grips with them from a maneuver perspective. So they're both kind of doing different things. This one enforces a rigid behavior of the two units interacting with each other. This game doesn't, but does disincentivize you. Very similar to some other games that we looked at in this period. Brings to mind like the Via Victis series. Like you can do whatever you want with cavalry, but you're just incentivized in some cases. But in both cases, the flank is really important. The flanking bonus that you get when you attack infantry with cavalry is very punishing, and that's actually what allows you to attack as the cavalry. And generally, you want to follow historically appropriate doctrine for cavalry versus infantry. I am satisfied with both. I actually think that the cavalry system in BAR is freeform enough to let you do what you want, but also not so freeform that it's ahistorical like we saw with the Via Victis series or other tactical games that we've looked at. Here, very rigid, and the interplay between the two is actually kind of subtle, and it's not until you play a game that you can really understand the role of cavalry in this period of warfare and how they can be used effectively. Typically, it's going to be cavalry versus cavalry. BAR as well. A lot of the cavalry engagements are going to be against each other, and I just find them both great. They both give a flavor of how horsemen on the battlefield were used. I should also mention there are dragoon units in Bayonet and Musket. I believe there are dragoons in BAR as well, but they are there's no real difference with dragoons per se. They can mount and dismount, I think, if I'm not mistaken. In Bayonet and Musket, you have to choose mounted or dismounted if you have the option from the counter mix. Otherwise, dragoons are typically weaker cavalry in this system, or if they're on foot, they're kind of weaker infantry. So they're kind of like the worst of all worlds, which is interesting. Yeah, so it's an interesting mix. So that may be because dragoons in this period and dragoons in this period were sort of more developed in the 7 Years' War than they were here. So that's cavalry. Now let's talk about maneuver and linear warfare. This is going to be the biggest category because I think it encompasses movement, it encompasses battle tactics, it encompasses command, and both of these games are doing very different things when it comes to command. Okay, so linear warfare, the state of 18th century warfare and the way that armies were arrayed and fought. Let's start with BAR. As you've seen from my playthroughs, you know that BAR makes a really big deal of the maneuver of formations of units. Different armies have different movement costs for going from line to column, from turning left and right in those formations. There's also a host of different formations that you can adopt: hooks, skirmish, road column. Artillery has its own formations, facing changes for units of different armies and nationalities. There's a lot in this game about the way that the armies moved. And in general, the system does allow you a lot of freedom of movement. Any formation can move however it wants. If I want to send these units off this way and this unit off this way and these units like this, I could make my army look like this. Now, there are reasons you don't want to do that, typically with the penalties for being flanked, which in both systems, flanking is the worst thing that you can have. And in the linear era, that was what armies were trying to do, was outflank each other. So you may not want to do that, but you have the option of doing that. And actually, you can do some things that I guess might be considered ahistorical, where, you know, a line moves up and one of these units comes around this direction. As long as they're still in command range, they can do that. So it does feel permissive, let's use that word, permissive for your unit maneuver. What really keeps it like sort of on the rails is this maneuver system where you're changing different formations, you're turning at different movement speed rates, and in general, each army has its own character of maneuver. But there's a lot of freedom of maneuver, very permissive maneuver structure for battles from the Age of Reason. And that may be, again, because War of 7 Years' War and a War of Austrian Succession and even the American Revolution, it was a more permissive maneuver structure as we approach the Napoleonic era. By contrast, Banish All Their Fears as a very restrictive maneuver system. This is not a game of maneuver. Your formations are extremely limited in terms of where they can go and what they can do. When you activate a brigade, depending on what order they're in, and we'll come to orders and command and stuff like that, they can either move however they want. Like if they're in a maneuver order, there's freedom to move. If they're in a recover order, they can only move forward or backwards. And if they're in an attack order, a charge order, then they have very specific requirements about who they can attack. Typically, it's the 2 hexes in front. If not those, then it will be someone who's trying to outflank them. And if it's not those, it'll be 2 hexes in front. What that means is when you're playing the game, the units really only are moving forward and backward when they're attacking. There is not a lot of this, like this guy moves up and comes into a flank and this guy pins here, right? You're not going to see that in this system because the units were basically trained to keep everything looking forward, right? So this is not a game of maneuver. This is a game of command. BAR is a game of both, but the maneuver is much more liberal with what you can do with your units. As it pertains to command, in BAR, command is basically a function of distance. You are going to have your entire army organization, which you can see here. As I launch counters. You can see the wings of the army, which is very similar to Bayonet Musket, along with the commander, the units in those battalions in those sort of wings commands, which I guess would typically be brigades, and all of the unit stats, right? When you the way that you stay in command in BAR is that you're within a certain number of hexes from the leader command structure. So here we have a wing commander. He has a command range of 5 as long as one of his sub-commanders is within 5 hexes of him, then this commander can give 5 hexes of command to his units. So you're keeping these chains of commands across the battlefield to try and keep all your units in command. Now, being out of command in this game is not super bad unless you're trying to do something like charge or attack or other types of behavior, but you can usually always move. Even if you're out of command, there is a unit initiative, a brigade initiative in this that allows units to move around the map kind of at will with some restrictions. Keeping this command structure is sort of tight together, making sure your network is followed along from each of the hexes is key to playing the game most efficiently, but you sometimes and often will find yourself at the middle of a battle that is broken down and you don't have that anymore. And then it's based on a die roll based on your leader's activation. So here, this guy, he's an 8, if you can see that. So if he was out of command from his wing leader, or sorry, not the 8, the 7. If he was out of command from the wing leader, you need to roll a 7 or less to activate him. So kind of like Library of Napoleonic Battles, we're getting more towards like a Napoleonic model of command, but it is based on distance. In Bayonet and Musket, this is sort of the central thesis of the game, and it is completely different. You have a brigade counter that represents the battalions of that brigade. This is going to be on a side sheet, and that side sheet is going to give you the relative positions of the armies based on the wings that are geographically defined on the map. BAR does not have that. There are no geographic limits to where the brigades and stuff can limit. You can overlap units. You could have units be marching like in a 6 rows deep, different brigades marching all going different directions. There's no requirement to stay in any sort of linear formation. Now you probably want to be, but in Bayonet and Musket, you must stay in linear formation. The game enforces it. If this brigade counter, let's say, is in this particular, see the red lines, in this particular wing of the army, and there's another brigade counter on the display, on the side display next to it here, that means that the rightmost unit of this brigade cannot overlap the hex row of the leftmost unit of the brigade that's next to it. And so because we're playing a game of relative brigade positioning, you must keep your formations linear and in compliance with the way that the brigades are set out on the command display. This kind of drives the game's maneuver and positioning, because you'll get into situations where you really want to move a brigade over here to take advantage of an attack, and you cannot because it would be in an illegal position with the brigades around it. But what it also does is it facilitates command decisions, and that is where this game is all about, what the game is all about, where the decision points in the game are. You can move your brigades from the different lines, so there's always a front, a support, and a reserve, and you're moving those brigades on the command display up and down and left and right, and that allows your units to either move forward of certain other units, or move left and right of certain other units, or even transfer from a wing to another wing to help support an attack. This whole game is about that, is about those decisions, which your commander trying to commit his forces in a spot where he thinks it'll be most useful. And once they're committed, you can't really get them out of there without a lot of hard work and difficulty and command friction. So this game is modeling command friction much more stringently than Battles from the Age of Reason. This is really a function of distance, and there's unit initiative. Here, if you get in the wrong spot and you're forced, your illegal position based on the command display, you're essentially, your brigade can't do anything. They've got to move to get into sort of a legal position. It's an interesting model of the way that commanders function during this period. In addition to that, you've got orders. There are 3 orders in the game. There is a charge order, there's a march order, and a dress ranks order. Charge is how you attack. You cannot attack if you're not in charge. And again, if you're in an illegal position and you're under a charge order, you actually cannot attack. You will be treated as if you're in a march order. You have to move to get in compliance with the way that the army was told to stand. Movement, march, this is the most freedom. You can move around as long as you maintain your compliance with other brigades near you, in front and back and left and right. And dress ranks is sort of a recovery order. This allows you to disengage from units by moving backwards 1 hex or moving forward 1 hex. It allows you to recover step losses and generally puts you back into a state of order. Your command decisions are all about switching between these orders in a cycle so that you can get your forces back up to the combat and engage efficiently against your opponent. So Bayonet and Musket is a tactical game about command decisions. It is not a tactical game about maneuver. BAR, much more heavy on the maneuver, way less about the command decisions. All you really have to do is make sure that these units can trace lines of connection to each other, and then your maneuver is going to determine how you prosecute the battle. So 2 different, very different approaches, and I actually think they're both equally valid and interesting. War gamers who play a lot of tactical games, especially Napoleonics, will be much more comfortable here because they're not limited in ways that they're not used to being limited. Bayonet and Musket is going to feel like a knife fight on train tracks, basically. And that is because it's about the commands, not about the maneuver. You may not like that. I personally think the model and restrictiveness of linear warfare and what the game is choosing to highlight as the important player decision points is really, really good. I think it conforms really well with the types of things that you read about from the commanders of this period and the types of challenges they had once a battle was joined and engaged. And for that reason, and because it's so unique, I really, really like Bayonet and Musket for reflecting linear warfare with those restrictive rules. Don't get me wrong, I like BAR as well. I think BAR is great. I enjoy playing BAR. But when I've played the 2 back-to-back, I can definitely see that the modeling going on in Bayonet and Musket is really focused in on making you feel like you're in charge of troops that you don't have control over, whereas in BAR, you're much more of an omnipotent kind of manipulator of forces. And so, your mileage may vary. You may prefer one of those to the other, but I do think Bayonet and Musket is doing something truly unique in approaching this period, where it would have been easy to just make a tactical game that feels like every other tactical game. Is there anything else I need to talk about? I guess the only other thing I would talk about when it comes to command and linear warfare is the terrain of these 2 games. There isn't really terrain in this game. That's not because there's not terrain. There is terrain, but most of these battlefields are pretty clear. It doesn't really deal with elevation changes or anything like that, whereas BAR, the terrain is much more sophisticated, as we talked about, mostly given the scale, but also where these battles were fought and whatnot. I think both are great systems. I want to see games in both of these systems. And I think if you're looking for the sort of models of how tactics have evolved over the 18th century, you can go from Bayonets and Musket to Battles from the Age of Reason and basically capture 100 years of history. From 1689 to 1783, you get a 100-year spread of battles and the way that tactics and command and strategy and doctrine changed. And you can kind of see that here. You can see the way that warfare was approaching the more mobile artillery unit initiative focus of the Napoleonic era. You start from coming out of musket and pike and, coming out of the musket and pike era into the start of linear warfare through the end of linear warfare, and then the Napoleonic era begins. So it's a really cool time travel thing that allows you to look at the history in that way. And, for my interest in the 18th century, I think it's actually, these are great companion systems, even though they're both, I would say this is mid-heavy and this is quite heavy. If you can learn them both, you can get a really nice feel for the way the designers feel 18th century warfare developed over many decades. The last thing I'll say about both is the doctrine. This kind of combines both fire and maneuver into kind of one thing, mostly fire. The fire combat in this period, there was a lot of different models based on what country was firing. I think BAR captures it more with the multiplier system better than Bayonet and Musket, which doesn't really concern itself with fire by rank versus fire by platoon. But that was something that the commanders of all the armies of this period, and certainly in the early 18th century, were looking at. How do we get more efficient massed fire from our line of infantry? BAR, I think, resolution to that is very good. A better trained army that's firing by platoon would have a higher multiplier versus in Banish All Their Fears, they would have a higher combat value. You're not going to get anything as explicit as the Via Victis system where you've got units that are specified as fire by rank or fire by platoon who use different combat fire tables. which I think is still the best expression of those two things of any of the games that we've looked at. I think that's the one real thing that system has over every other system that we have looked at in these videos is sort of the fire doctrine. But it is reflected abstractly in both of these systems, and I think BAR actually comes the closest to what Via Victis was doing. From a production value standpoint, both of these games are absolutely beautiful. The counters in BAR are that Clash of Arms beauty uniform style. You see some Austrians here, Austrian uniforms. The counters in Bayonets and Musket are really love it or hate it, given the artistic choice to go with sort of masses of troops seen from above that are hard to see, especially even when you get close to it. But I highly recommend both systems. As you know, I am a fan of both. And it's going to be great that we are getting new games in these series, hopefully in the near future. Battles for Quebec from Clash of Arms should be coming out very soon. That is going to be a topic and a game that I think is going to be probably near the top of my list for the year. And I've already talked about Volume 2 of Banish All Their Fear, or Bayonet Musket, which is called Over the Hills and Far Away, which will include the Battle of Steenkirk from the War of the League of Augsburg and the Battle of Romilly, which is another of Marlborough's great victories from the War of Spanish Succession. So that is a look at the way that these games reflect their history and their the tactics of the time. Hope you enjoyed that. Definitely watch part 1 of this video series, I guess you'd call it, if you want to see other games and how they express these ideas. But I would say of all of the games I have looked at through this lens, these two are my favorite.